June 14, 1944. Late afternoon. Camp Aliceville, Alabama, a flat stretch of wire and barracks rimmed by pines and the lazy hum of cicadas. The train disgorged them in a cloud of steam and the sour sweat of men who had been packed like cargo for days. Lieutenant Karl Muller stepped down from the freight car with his cap pulled low, the braid of his collar dark with grime. He smelled diesel, the sharp metallic tang of rail, and somewhere under it all a foreign sweetness, frying grease, sugar, coffee. Around him, the other prisoners of war shuffled with the same slow disbelief, gaunt faces, uniform jackets threadbare at the elbows, the stiff, automatic obedience of men who still moved as if ordered. The camp gate yawned open and olive-drab MPs stood like a solid line of reason, young, square-shouldered Americans with helmets tipped back, M1 rifles slung, polished boots that had never known surrender. Some of them were black. Not a few, not an exception. Black American soldiers in olive drab, brass glinting on chest pockets, the same fatigues as their white counterparts. Muller blinked. For a heartbeat reality stuttered. He had been fed a steady diet of certainty, propaganda posters in crisp black type, radio speeches that spoke of racial hierarchy as if it were iron law. He had heard stories about American decadence and disunity. He had never once been told that the same land which preached white supremacy would place black and white men side by side, armed and official, at the threshold of victory. They were ushered into a processing shed where a buzz of activity swallowed the town's heat. A corporal barked names into a ledger. A short-order cook flipped pancakes on a sizzling griddle behind a screen of steam. The smell of bacon snagged at Muller's memory, at once domestic and impossible. He was handed a metal mess tin and pointed toward the mess hall, a long low building whose windows rattled with conversation. Inside, the mess hall was its own small, ordered world. Lantern light from hanging bulbs threw the long tables into bands of gold. Rows of men in uniforms, olive drab, faded feldgrau, the occasional civilian coat, moved like a current. Black soldiers stood at the serving line wearing the same greasy aprons as white soldiers, ladling stew from a steaming pot, slinging bread into tins. The clang of spoons against metal, the soft thud of boots on wood planks, an old radio churning out a jazz tune from somewhere in the corner, and above it, the easy, practiced shouting of men who had never believed in fear of each other. Muller's hands trembled as he took his rations. He watched a sergeant, a broad man with a face like a map of years in the sun, joke with a private about the weather. Both laughed, one black, one white, faces creased with the same human lines. They reached across each other to pass a crate of oranges as if there were no invisible law separating them. Muller's throat tightened with an animal sensation that was part insult, part awe. Outside, the guard towers cut silhouettes into the heat-hazed sky. A black MP on the platform adjusted his binoculars and waved to a white lieutenant below. The gesture was casual but precise. It was a language of habit, not of doctrine. Muller had dreamed of beating the Americans by exposing their weaknesses. Instead, he found a new, unsettling competence, a country willing, in the soft mechanics of everyday life, to make practical alliances across the color line when it suited necessity and humanity. At night, in the barracks, the men slept fitfully on cots smelling of camp soap and fresh-cut pine. Conversations began in murmurs and built like the simmer of a pot. Muller found himself sharing a plank with Corporal Franz Becker, a hard-pressed radio operator from the Eastern Front. Becker had a habit of whistling old regiment songs, but tonight his eyes were drawn toward a whispered story, how a black cook in the mess line had defied an officer's curt orders to let a trembling farmer's boy have an extra piece of bread. He just smiled and said, "Everyone's hungry," Becker murmured. The story seemed small until Muller thought of the farmer back in Posen and the orders he had obeyed there without question. Rumors traveled faster than the evening chow. A group of prisoners traded notes about a farm detail where Germans and Americans had worked side by side repairing fences, black soldiers and white soldiers hauling rails together without a single remark. Another whispered that a black sergeant had been allowed to marry his bride in a small chapel near the camp and the ceremony had been attended by officers of different shades. The story struck at the bedrock of what the prisoners had been told to believe about the enemy, that they were hosts of weakness and moral decay. Muller hesitated, then accepted. The bread was warm, salty, ordinary. He took a bite and felt the world tilt a fraction. This single, ordinary kindness threaded through the camp like a new grammar. It was practical, unremarkable, and fatal to tidy prejudices. Inside the barracks, arguments blossomed, soft, then louder, about the meaning of what they'd seen. For some it was betrayal. How could the supposed enemy have this functional moral center? For others it planted a seed of confusion, the first small fissure in a worldview carved deep by years of training and lies. Muller lay awake, thinking of his father's sermons and the crisp black and white certainties they'd been built on, and for the first time in a long time, he tasted doubt. Morning brought the rattle of tin trays and the thump of boots on dirt. The Alabama sun had already turned the sky into a pale, merciless blue. Carl Muller blinked against it as he lined up for roll call, the sound of insects threading through the stillness. Behind the wire, America moved like a slow, confident machine, trucks groaning past with crates of food, radio chatter drifting from the guard towers, and the low whistle of a train somewhere beyond the pines. At breakfast, the mess hall scene repeated itself. White and black soldiers served side by side, trading jokes across the line of steaming trays. One man, a tall, black corporal with sleeves rolled up to his elbows, poured coffee with a rhythm that matched the radio jazz crackling overhead. When Muller took his tray, the corporal nodded and said, "Good morning," with a grin that held no mockery. Muller froze a moment before returning the gesture with an awkward "Danke." He sat at a long table near the back, his hands around the tin cup, still feeling the echo of that exchange. Becker slid onto the bench beside him. "You see that?" Becker muttered under his breath. "They talk to us like we're equals." He said the last word as if it were forbidden. Across the room, a white sergeant clapped the black corporal on the shoulder, laughing about a baseball score. The corporal laughed too, not flinching, not deferring, just two men sharing a joke over breakfast. Muller couldn't decide what shocked him more, the ease of it, or the fact that no one else in the room seemed to find it strange. Later, the prisoners were divided into work details. Muller's group was assigned to repair fences on the camp's outer fields, supervised by Sergeant Thomas Reeves, a middle-aged white American with sunburned skin and a voice like gravel. The team also included Private Elijah Carter, a black mechanic from Georgia. Carter was quick with tools and quicker with conversation, humming blues melodies while working the wire. As they hammered posts into the earth, Reeves barked orders that treated both Carter and the Germans with the same rough fairness. "Hey Carter, grab me that spool. Muller, you too, don't stand there gawking, wire it tight." The symmetry of command, the casual cooperation, made Muller's head ache. Back home, the chain of superiority was the only rhythm he knew. Here, there was no master ace rhetoric, no visible hierarchy beyond competence. During the midday break, Carter leaned against a post, pulling a tin from his pocket. "Peach tobacco," he said, offering some. Muller hesitated, then accepted. The flavor was foreign, sweet, almost intoxicating. Carter studied him with calm curiosity. "They say y'all thought we were treated like animals over here," he said. Muller swallowed. "We were told that your people could not serve. That America kept you apart." Carter gave a short laugh. "Oh, they keep us apart plenty, don't worry. But in this uniform, I get my say. I fight the same enemy as the next man, eat the same bread. That's more than I could say a few years back." He looked out toward the horizon, where the trees shimmered in the heat. "Thing is," he added quietly, "they can't keep us apart forever. Not when we bleed the same in the mud." That night, Muller wrote in his small, tattered journal. His handwriting was cramped and slanted, as if the pen resisted the thought, "We were told America is divided, that the Negro is beneath contempt. Yet today, I worked beside one. He fixed the wire faster than any of us." The sergeant trusted him completely. "It makes no sense. How can they fight together if they do not believe the same?" He stopped, staring at the ink, realizing how thin the words felt against what he'd seen. Days turned into weeks. The rhythm of camp life took hold: work, meals, inspection, rest. The initial shock faded into a dull, persistent curiosity. Prisoners began asking questions, quiet ones, careful ones. How did America decide who could serve? Why did black and white men share the same rations? Some answers came from guards who didn't mind talking. "Things ain't perfect," one said, "but a man's a man out here. You work, you eat. Simple as that." That simplicity gnawed at Muller. In Germany, everything had been about blood, lineage, and purity. Here, it seemed to come down to function, what a person could do. One Sunday afternoon, the prisoners were allowed to attend a church service outside the main compound. The camp chaplain, a white lieutenant, led the prayer, but the organ was played by a black private whose deep baritone voice filled the small chapel. Amazing Grace echoed through the rafters. The sound hit Muller in the chest like a hammer. The men around him, Germans, Americans, black and white, all stood under the same roof, heads bowed, voices rising in the same tune. After the service, Becker turned to him, eyes wide. "Do you realize what we just saw? They worship together. Muller nodded slowly. Yes, he said, and no one told them not to. He didn't sleep much that night. The laughter outside, the music from a guard's harmonica, the smell of tobacco, they all blended into something he couldn't name. Maybe it was freedom, maybe hypocrisy, maybe both. But one thing was certain, the world beyond that wire was not the one he had been trained to believe existed. August 3, 1944. The Alabama heat pressed down like a blanket. Cicadas screamed in the trees, the sound so constant it felt like the world itself was vibrating. Carl Muller walked along the outer fence line with his work detail, the coarse wire humming beneath his gloved hands. His shirt clung to his back. Sweat rolled down his neck. Yet his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. That he couldn't shake what he'd seen these past weeks, the way the Americans lived side by side, black and white, eating together, arguing together, working like it was the most natural thing in the world. There were still tensions, yes, sharp words, the occasional argument, but it was allowed. They could argue without fear of punishment. They could disagree and still eat at the same table. That it nodded him, because for all of Germany's talk about order and strength, it suddenly seemed fragile, built on fear, not confidence. That afternoon, while hauling fence posts to the storage shed, Muller saw something he couldn't forget. Near the motor pool, a black mechanic and a white lieutenant crouched side by side under the hood of a broken Jeep. The mechanic, Carter, the same man who'd offered him tobacco weeks ago, was explaining something, gesturing to a gasket with a grease-streaked wrench. The lieutenant nodded, taking instruction. Taking instruction from a black man, the scene played out with quiet efficiency. No one shouted, no one looked over their shoulders. Just men fixing a machine. To Muller, it was like watching a heresy being performed without consequence. Later, when they returned to the barracks, Becker snorted. They pretend equality, he said. Don't you see, it's theater. They let the colored men serve food or fix trucks, but who commands the divisions? Who signs the orders? White men, always white men. Muller stared at him. Maybe, but they still speak to each other. They still trust each other to fight. I saw that mechanic order a lieutenant to move his hand, and he did. Becker, would you have done that back home? Becker didn't answer. His silence was an admission more than any argument could be. That night, a storm rolled across the camp. Rain lashed the tin roofs, thunder thumped like distant artillery. The prisoners crowded near the windows, watching lightning fracture the sky. Muller sat on his cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of the storm and the faint sound of singing drifting from the guard quarters. A chorus of black voices harmonizing to a hymn he didn't understand. For a moment, he was back in Poland, standing in the ruins of a burned village, remembering the cries of people herded into a barn by men wearing the same uniform as him. He had told himself it was duty, that Germany was destiny. Now, in this small, rain-soaked corner of America, he began to wonder if destiny could be wrong. The next morning, the camp commander, Captain Reynolds, assembled the prisoners in the yard. A truck had overturned on a nearby road, spilling its cargo. They needed volunteers to help clean up. Muller's hand went up before he thought about it. The scene outside the camp was chaos, crates of food, tools, and mail scattered across the red dirt. American soldiers, black and white, worked together to clear the mess. An older black sergeant, gray at the temples, directed traffic with authority and humor, barking at privates to hurry before the Alabama sun cooked them alive. "Hey, Kraut," the sergeant called when Muller approached. "You speak English?" Muller nodded cautiously. "Good. Then grab that side of the crate. Careful, that's eggs." They worked together for an hour, sweat streaking their faces, laughter mixing with curses. When it was done, the sergeant wiped his brow and offered Muller a cigarette. "You know," he said, lighting it, "I used to think all you fellas were monsters." Muller hesitated. "And now?" The sergeant shrugged. "Now I think you're just men who got lied to." He blew out smoke. "Happens to all of us, I guess." That sentence clung to Muller's mind the entire walk back to camp. Men who got lied to. He wondered what lies this man had been told in his own country, and whether the two of them weren't just standing on opposite ends of the same truth. Weeks passed, and the POWs began to settle into a strange rhythm of coexistence. Some even learned English from the guards. Others picked up baseball, standing in the dust with gloves stitched from old rags, laughing when they missed a catch. Muller found himself helping Carter tune a radio one evening. The two men crouched over the machine like students. When the crackle cleared and a big band song came through, Carter grinned and said, "See, sometimes you just need the right frequency." In his journal that night, he wrote, "I think I understand now. Their strength is not just machines or factories. It is this, the ability to share a table, to fight and forgive." They build power not from purity, but from practice. We built ours on fear, and fear does not last. Outside, the guard towers hummed under the night wind. Somewhere, a trumpet played softly in the dark. Muller closed his eyes, and for the first time since capture, he felt not defeat, but humility. The war was ending, though no one inside Camp Aliceville spoke of it aloud. Rumors ran like water through the barracks. Berlin surrounded. Hitler missing. The Reich collapsing. For Karl Muller, the news no longer brought rage or even sorrow, only a quiet, hollow acceptance. That morning, he sat by the fence line, whittling a small block of pine into the shape of a bird. The wood was soft, easy to carve. Its wings began to take form beneath his knife. On the other side of the wire, Sergeant Reeves and Private Carter were arguing about baseball again, a running debate about who had the better fastball. Their laughter drifted over the wire like the scent of coffee. Muller thought back to the man he had been 2 years ago, proud, certain, armored in belief. That man would have spat at the idea of sharing food or laughter with his inferiors. That man would have called this sight, black and white soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, a perversion of nature. Now, it seemed the only sane thing left in a world gone mad. Later that week, Captain Reynolds gathered the prisoners under the flagpole. The camp radio confirmed what many already suspected: Adolf Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered. The Reich had fallen. For a moment, there was silence. Then a low murmur passed through the crowd, like wind across tall grass. Some men wept quietly, others stared at the dirt. A few muttered curses under their breath. Muller felt something else, not grief, not relief, but a strange, crushing clarity. Reynolds dismissed them. You'll all be processed for repatriation soon. The war's over, gentlemen. Time to go home. That night, the mess hall was subdued. The usual jazz had been replaced by a soft hymn played on a harmonica. The guards moved slower, quieter. Muller sat at his usual table, staring into his cup of weak coffee. Across the room, Carter caught his eye and nodded. It was a simple gesture, acknowledgement between two men who had shared the same blistering sun, the same dust, the same fatigue. When Muller left the hall, Carter was waiting by the door. So, you're going home soon, Carter said. Yes, Muller answered. If there is still a home to return to. Carter smiled faintly. There's always a home somewhere. Sometimes you just have to build it again. Muller wanted to say something, to thank him, perhaps, or to apologize for everything his country had done, but the words tangled in his throat. Instead, he reached into his pocket and handed Carter the small wooden bird he'd carved. For your radio, Muller said quietly. So it has company. Carter turned the carving in his hand. A dove, he said. Fitting. When the transport trains came, Muller climbed aboard with a rucksack slung over one shoulder. The countryside rolled by, fields, rivers, towns untouched by bombs. America stretched endlessly, impossibly vast. He watched black farmers wave at white truck drivers on the same road, both tipping their hats in greeting. It wasn't perfect harmony, but it was something that didn't exist where he came from, possibility. Weeks later, when Muller finally stepped off the ship in Bremerhaven, the air smelled of ash and rain. Germany was a ruin, skeletal buildings, hollow-eyed children, soldiers without uniforms. He walked through the wreckage like a ghost, clutching the single photograph he had taken before leaving camp, a grainy image of a baseball game, prisoners and guards laughing together under the Alabama sun. His neighbors avoided him. His old regiment was gone. The flags were gone too, but the memory of that camp, of the mornings where black and white men shared bread without hatred, stayed with him. It haunted him in the best possible way that he took work where he could, repairing fences, fixing radios, helping rebuild roofs. When the occupation forces arrived, he surprised himself by volunteering as an interpreter for the Americans. The first time he shook hands with a black sergeant from New York, he felt no hesitation at all. In 1948, Muller received a letter, the envelope stamped U.S. Army Postal Service. Inside was a short note written in tidy cursive. Carl, I still keep that bird on my radio. It reminds me that even behind wire, men can still learn something true. Muller smiled, folded the letter, and placed it inside his journal beside the old entries, the ones filled with confusion and disbelief. He looked out at the gray sky above Bremen and thought of that endless American horizon, of the guards' laughter, of the sound of jazz at dusk. For the first time, he understood what had really defeated Germany. It wasn't just tanks, or bombers, or factories. It was a simple truth that no bullet could kill, that dignity, once shared, is stronger than fear, the kind of strength born not from purity, but from people willing to sit at the same table and eat together.